The auction hall smelled like rust and fear. Valeker Station was the kind of place that decent beings pretended did not exist. A spinning heap of metal and misery on the edge of civilized space, where anything with a pulse could be bought, and anything with a price could be sold. Warden Lord Scytharak stood in the upper observation gallery, his 4 chitinous arms folded behind his back, his compound eyes scanning the cages below with the patience of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He was Draelith, and among the Draelith he was legendary. 7 feet of armored exoskeleton, mandibles that could crush stone, and a mind so sharp it had turned the breaking of wills into an art form. Every species in the compact had sent representatives to his compound at one point or another, sometimes willingly and sometimes not, and every single one had eventually knelt before him. The Torvans with their thick hides and warrior pride had lasted 11 days. The Neshki hive minds with their shared consciousness and distributed pain tolerance had lasted 19. Even a Palaxian empath, a creature that could weaponize emotion itself, had broken in under a month. Scytharak kept records the way a painter keeps a portfolio. Today he was shopping for something new. The auctioneer, a greasy little Venari with too many teeth, was cycling through the lots with practiced speed, rattling off species and condition codes and reserve prices like he was selling livestock, which of course he was. Scytharak ignored most of it. He had no interest in more Torvans or another batch of Clixian laborers. He wanted something rare, something he had not yet tested his methods against. And then Lot 47 was dragged into the light. The creature was small. That was the first thing Scytharak noticed, how absurdly small it was compared to almost everything else in the hall. It stood on 2 legs with no tail for balance, no armor plating, no visible claws or fangs or venom sacs. Its skin was soft and pale, and marked with scars that told a story of violence survived. Its hair was dark and cut short, and its eyes were a strange muddy green that moved constantly, scanning the room the way a predator scans a hunting ground, even though everything about this creature said it was prey. The auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the species. Human. Scytharak leaned forward. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely 2 centuries into faster-than-light travel and already making noise far beyond their size. They had fought the Kreth Dominion to a standstill in the outer reach, which should have been impossible for a species with no natural weapons, and a lifespan so short it was almost insulting. The intelligence briefings called them adaptable. Scytharak called them untested. He placed his bid before anyone else could. The price was low because no one else in the room knew what to do with a human, and the creature was damaged besides, thin from poor feeding and bearing the marks of rough handling during capture. The auctioneer slammed his chime, and the deal was done. Scytharak sent his guards to collect the purchase. The human did not fight when they came for him. He did not scream or beg or try to bite or claw the way most new acquisitions did. He simply stood up, looked at the guards with those strange moving eyes, and walked with them as if he had decided to go rather than been forced. This was noted. Scytharak met his new property in the processing chamber of his private transport vessel. The human had been stripped and scanned and fitted with a neural compliance collar, a thin band of dark metal around his throat that could deliver pain signals directly to the nervous system at varying intensities. It was Scytharak's favorite tool, elegant and precise and capable of reducing the strongest warrior to a screaming wreck without leaving a single mark. The human touched the collar once, ran his fingers along its edge as if memorizing its shape, and then dropped his hand. He looked up at Scytharak and did not flinch. Scytharak found this mildly interesting. He towered over the creature by nearly 3 feet and outweighed it by several hundred pounds and was covered in natural armor that could deflect blade strikes. And yet the human looked at him, the way one might look at a large piece of furniture, with acknowledgement but no particular concern. "You are Corporal Elias Wren," Scythorak said, reading from the capture file on his data pad. "Colonial Marine Corps, 3rd Expeditionary Division, captured during a skirmish near the Tannhäuser Relay." The human said nothing for a moment. Then he tilted his head slightly and said, "So what is the food situation like here?" Scythorak blinked, all 6 eyes cycling in sequence, which was the Drelith equivalent of a double take. In his long career of acquiring and processing subjects, he had heard begging and threats and prayers and curses in silence, but he had never once been asked about the catering. "You will be fed according to your nutritional requirements," Scythorak replied, uncertain why he was answering at all. "Great," the human said, "because whoever had me before you was really bad at that part." Scythorak studied him. There was no tremor in the voice, no dilation of the pupils that would suggest hidden terror, no chemical markers of acute stress in the bioscan readings streaming to his data pad. The human was not performing courage. He simply was not afraid, or if he was, his body had decided that fear was not a useful response and had shut it down like an unnecessary system. Fascinating. Scythorak had the human transported to his compound on the barren moon of Keth 4, a place of gray rock and thin atmosphere where the sky was always dark, and the silence was heavy enough to crush weaker minds. The compound was designed for one purpose, and it fulfilled that purpose with architectural brutality: long corridors that led nowhere, cells with walls that shifted color to disorient, lighting that never followed a natural cycle. Every detail existed to strip away a being's sense of control and replace it with dependency. Elias was placed in a standard isolation cell. Scythorak watched through the observation feed as the human explored his new cage with calm efficiency, checking corners and surfaces, and the door mechanism and the waste facility and the thin sleeping platform. He moved like someone cataloging information rather than someone trapped. When he was done, he sat on the platform, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes. Scythorak waited for the panic to set in. It did not. After one full day of observation during which the human slept and woke and performed strange repetitive physical exercises on the floor of his cell and slept again, Scythorak decided it was time to begin. He activated the neural collar remotely, setting it to level 3, which was moderate intensity, enough to make a Torvan howl. Through the observation feed, he watched Elias drop to his knees as the pain signal tore through his nervous system. The human's face twisted and his hands slammed flat against the floor, and a thin line of blood ran from his nose where capillaries had burst under the pressure. The cycle lasted 30 seconds. When it ended, Elias stayed on his knees for a moment, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. Then he wiped the blood from his upper lip with the back of his hand. And he stood up. He did not cry out. He did not beg for it to stop. He did not ask why. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, and stared directly into the observation lens as if he knew exactly where Scythorak was watching from. Scythorak logged the session in his records and marked it as unremarkable. He would not make that mistake again. The first week followed the standard protocol. Scythorak had refined his methods over decades, and he applied them now with the confidence of a surgeon who had performed the same operation 1,000 times. Day 1 through 3 was sensory deprivation. The cell lights were killed entirely, plunging the human into a darkness so complete that most species began to hallucinate within hours. The walls were soundproof to eliminate even the faint hum of the station's power grid, and the temperature was held at a precise neutral so that the subject could not even feel the air against their skin. It was like floating in nothing. The Torvans had begun screaming by hour 6. The Neshki had started broadcasting distress signals through their hive link by hour 4. Elias Wren fell asleep. Scythorak stared at the infrared feed in disbelief, as the human curled up on the sleeping platform and drifted off as calmly as if he were in a comfortable bed on a safe world, with nothing wrong at all. He slept for nearly 9 hours. When he woke, he stretched his arms above his head, yawned loudly enough for the cell microphones to pick it up, and began doing push-ups in the dark. Scythorak called in his chief psychologist. Alven was Neshki, a small insectoid being with delicate antennae and a mind like a razor, and she had served Scythorak for 12 years, helping him understand the psychological architecture of each new species so he could take it apart more efficiently. She reviewed the data from the deprivation period, and her antennae went very still, which was the Neshki expression of deep unease. "The human brain is generating its own stimulation," she said quietly. "During unconsciousness, it produces elaborate internal sensory experiences, visual and auditory and emotional and tactile, all without any external input whatsoever." "It is dreaming," Scythorak said, because he had read this in the briefing files and dismissed it as irrelevant. "It is not irrelevant," Alven replied as if she had read his mind. "It means you cannot truly deprive this species of sensation because they carry an entire world inside their skulls, and they go there every time they close their eyes." Scythorak dismissed the concern and moved to Phase 2. Starvation Protocol. The human's food was cut entirely for 4 days, with only minimal water provided to prevent organ failure. This was a reliable technique because hunger was universal, and the desperation it created was a powerful lever for establishing dependency. A starving subject who was then offered food by the hand of the one who starved them would begin to associate their captor with relief and survival, and from that association grew obedience. On day 2 of starvation, Scythorak checked the observation feed and found Elias doing burpees. On day 3, the human was doing pull-ups using the edge of the sleeping platform, which was not designed to be used that way, and which groaned under the strain. On day 4, Scythorak entered the monitoring room to find Alven already there, her antennae twitching rapidly. "His metabolic rate has dropped," she said, pulling up bioscan data on the display. "His body has begun rationing its energy reserves automatically, redirecting resources to essential systems and reducing waste processes, and his pain threshold has actually increased since the starvation began." She turned to look at Scythorak with her compound eyes. "This species does not simply endure deprivation, Warden Lord, they adapt to it in real time. Their bodies rewrite their own operating parameters to survive whatever conditions they encounter. I have never seen anything like it." Scythorak moved to temperature cycling. The cell was plunged to near freezing for 6 hours, then spiked to extreme heat for 6 hours, then dropped again in an endless punishing rhythm designed to exhaust the body's ability to regulate itself. Most species collapsed within 2 cycles. Elias shivered violently during the cold phases, his skin turning pale and his muscles contracting in visible spasms. But he did not collapse. Instead, on the 3rd cold cycle, the guards monitoring the cell block reported something unexpected. Singing. The human was singing. It was not beautiful or melodic or anything that could be called music in any refined sense of the word. It was rough and rhythmic and repetitive, a harsh chant that rose and fell in a pattern that seemed designed not for beauty, but for endurance. Each verse building on the last, like the human was using the sound of his own voice as a rope to pull himself through the pain. The guards did not know what to make of it. They were Dralith, born and bred for obedience and discipline, and they had never heard a prisoner sing under torture. The sound carried through the walls despite the soundproofing, because the human was loud in the way that desperate things are loud, not screaming but projecting, as if he was throwing his voice against the cold like a weapon. One of the younger guards, a conscript named Kale who had been assigned to the compound only recently, found himself stopping outside the cell door to listen. He did not understand the words, but something about the rhythm of it, the stubborn, relentless beat of it, made something shift in his chest in a way he could not name. Scythraq heard the singing through the monitoring system and felt the first flicker of something he had not experienced in a very long time. Irritation. Not the productive irritation of a challenge that sharpened the mind, but the deeper, more dangerous kind. The irritation of a professional encountering something that did not fit his models. He reviewed his records. By this point in the process, 14 days in, every previous subject had shown clear signs of psychological degradation, loss of coherent speech and disrupted sleep patterns and involuntary submission behaviors, and the desperate clinging need for any form of positive contact that signaled the beginning of true breaking. Elias showed none of these. His speech was coherent when he chose to speak. His sleep was regular, almost maddeningly so. He showed no submission behaviors whatsoever. And far from seeking positive contact, he seemed entirely self-contained, a closed system that generated its own warmth and its own purpose, and its own stubborn, inexplicable will to continue. Alven requested a formal meeting. She came with data displayed on a portable screen, and her antennae held in the rigid forward position that meant she was about to say something her employer would not want to hear. The human's neurological profile is unlike anything in our database, she said. Under sustained stress, most species show a linear increase in cortisol analogs leading to eventual system collapse, but the human stress response follows a different curve entirely. She showed him the graph. The hormones spike initially as expected, but then they plateau, and as the stressors continue, the plateau actually lowers. His brain is not simply enduring the stress, it is recalibrating its entire response system to treat the current conditions as the new normal. She paused. He is not resisting your methods, Warden Lord. He is absorbing them. His biology is literally rewriting itself around the damage. I strongly recommend discontinuation before. Before what? Scythraq interrupted. Alven's antennae trembled. Before this becomes something you cannot control. Scythraq dismissed her. He had broken beings that could shatter minds with a thought, and beings that could regenerate severed limbs, and beings that existed as distributed consciousness across multiple bodies. He was not going to be defeated by a small, soft creature that could not even see in the dark. That evening he went to the cell himself. The door opened with a hiss, and Scythraq filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the corridor, so that his shadow fell across the human like a shroud. Elias was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He was thinner than when he had arrived, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands had a faint tremor that had not been there before. But those strange green eyes looked up at Scythraq without flinching. Scythraq stepped inside, and the door sealed behind him. The cell felt very small with both of them in it. "You will kneel," Scythraq said, and his voice was the deep, resonant command tone that triggered instinctive submission responses in most vertebrate species. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward in something that was not quite a smile, but was certainly not fear. "You first," he said. Scythraq stood there in the silence of the cell, with the weight of his entire career, pressing against the simple, impossible fact of a creature half his size looking up at him from the floor and refusing to break. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the Warden Lord did not know what to do next. Scythraq changed his approach on the 19th day. If the human could not be broken through his own suffering, then perhaps he could be broken through the suffering of others. This was not a new technique, and in fact it was one of the oldest and most reliable tools in Scythraq's collection. Empathic leverage, the clinical term for making someone watch while you hurt the people around them. It worked because guilt was heavier than pain. Most species could endure their own torment far longer than they could endure being the cause of someone else's, and the mathematics of it were elegant in their cruelty. Every act of defiance from the subject resulted in punishment delivered not to them but to another prisoner. And eventually, the subject would break not because they were weak, but because they could not bear the weight of what their strength was costing others. Scythorak selected 3 subjects from the general population. A young Torvan male barely past adolescence who had been in the compound for 2 years and had long since been broken into quiet obedience. A Palaxian female whose empathic abilities had been dulled by months of chemical suppression. And an elderly Clixian whose 6 legs trembled when he walked, and whose eyes had the hollow emptiness of someone who had given up hopping for anything at all. They were brought to the central yard and made to kneel in a line. Elias was brought out and forced to stand facing them. Scythorak stood between them and explained the rules with the calm precision of someone reading terms and conditions. For every act of defiance from the human, one of these 3 would receive a full level 5 pain cycle through their collars. For every refusal to comply, one of them would lose food privileges for a day. For every word spoken without permission, one of them would be placed in extended isolation. The human's rebellion would no longer cost only himself. Elias looked at the 3 prisoners kneeling on the gray stone. The young Torvan would not meet his eyes. The Palaxian was trembling. The old Clixian stared at the ground as if he had already decided that whatever happened next was simply the way things were. Something shifted in the human's face. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes and a slight change in the way he held his jaw, but Scythorak saw it and felt a surge of satisfaction because he recognized that expression. It was the first crack. Elias stopped talking. He stopped exercising. He stopped singing. He complied with basic commands, stood when told to stand, moved when told to move, ate what was given to him, though he ate very little. On the surface, it looked like the beginning of submission. Scythorak logged his progress with renewed confidence and increased the observation frequency to catch the moment of full capitulation. But something was wrong with the compound. It started small. A young Torvan servant, one of the broken ones who moved through the corridors with the mechanical obedience of a machine, was caught on surveillance footage leaving a portion of his own food ration near the ventilation grate closest to Elias' cell. When questioned by the guards, he could not explain why he had done it. He simply said that he had wanted to. 3 days later, a Palaxian cleaning drone, whose job was to maintain the corridor floors, was recorded humming. Not just any sound, but the same rough rhythmic pattern that Elias had been singing during the temperature cycling weeks before, the same harsh cadence that had echoed through the cell block. The drone did not know where she had learned it. She said it had been stuck in her head, and she did not know how it got there. A Clixian in the labor pool began scratching marks on the underside of his workstation, small symbols that, when examined by security, turned out to be a crude calendar, tracking the number of days since the human had arrived. Scythorak reviewed the surveillance logs going back to the beginning, and what he found made his mandibles go rigid. In the gaps between sessions, in the brief windows when Elias was moved through corridors or held in waiting areas, or allowed his minimal exercise period in the yard, the human had been talking. Not loudly and not for long, just a few words here and there. A sentence passed to a Torvan while being escorted past the kitchens, a whispered phrase to a Palaxian through a cell wall, a look exchanged with the old Clixian across the exercise yard that carried more meaning than any words could. He had learned their names. This was the detail that struck Scythorak like a blade between his plates. In all his years, no subject under his control had ever bothered to learn the names of the other prisoners, because, when you were drowning in your own suffering, you did not have the capacity to see anyone else, and the isolation this created was one of the foundations of the entire system. But Elias had done it. He had looked past his own pain and seen the beings around him, and he had done the most human thing imaginable. He had introduced himself. "My name is Elias." The surveillance audio captured him whispering to the young Torvan through the kitchen wall. "What is yours?" "Torik," the Torvan had whispered back, and the way he said it, with a kind of wonder as if he had forgotten he had a name at all, was the sound of something waking up. Elias did not organize a rebellion. He did not make speeches or issue commands or draw up plans. He simply talked to people as if they were people, asked them about their lives and their homes and the things they remembered from before. And in doing so, he reminded them of something that the compound had been specifically designed to make them forget. That they existed. That they had existed before this place and could exist after it. That they were not inventory or property or numbers in Sithrak's records, but living beings with names and memories, and the fundamental unbreakable right to be recognized as such. He taught them a word. The surveillance audio caught it only once, a single whispered exchange between Elias and the Palaxian female through adjacent cell walls late at night, when the monitoring staff was at minimum. "There is a word in my language," Elias said, his voice barely audible, "for when things are bad but you believe they can be better, when you cannot see the way out but you know it is there. We call it hope." The Palaxian was silent for a long time. "We do not have this word," she finally said. "You do now," Elias replied. Alven came to Sithrak with data that made her antennae lie flat against her skull, which was the Neshki expression of fear. "Compliance metrics are dropping," she said, and her voice had lost its professional calm, not just in the subjects adjacent to the human but across the entire compound population. "Refusal incidents are up 40%. Work output is down. 3 guards have reported that prisoners are making eye contact with them, which has not happened in this facility in over 6 years. She placed a data tablet on Sithrak's desk. "The human is not resisting you, Warden Lord. He is doing something worse. He is making the others remember how to resist. He is not a prisoner. He is a contagion." Sithrak's response was immediate and violent. He ordered Elias moved to full isolation, a cell within a cell with no ventilation grates and no shared walls and no contact with any living being. He doubled the guard rotation. He increased the neural collar's baseline settings to level 6, which was continuous low-grade pain, designed to keep the subject in a state of perpetual distress that made coherent thought difficult. And then he went further. He accessed the collar's command interface and pushed the settings to level 8. Level 8 was not designed for interrogation or behavior modification. Level 8 was designed to cause neurological damage. It was the setting Sithrak used when he wanted to make a point, when he needed to demonstrate to an entire population what happened to those who defied him, and it had never failed to produce the desired result because no nervous system in the Compact's database could withstand level 8 without catastrophic breakdown. He activated it remotely and watched through the observation feed. Elias was standing in the center of his new cell when it hit. His body went rigid, and then it went to the floor, and then it began to seize, every muscle firing at once in a cascade of uncontrolled spasms that slammed his limbs against the hard surface, with sounds that the microphones picked up as dull, wet impacts. Blood ran from his nose and then from his ears. His back arched so severely that Sithrak heard vertebrae cracking through the audio feed. The cycle lasted 60 seconds. When it ended, Elias lay on the floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, twitching, his eyes open but unfocused and his breathing shallow and ragged. He did not move for a long time. Sithrak watched. The guards watched through the observation window, 4 of them standing in a row, their faces lit by the cold blue glow of the cell's emergency lighting. 3 of them watched with the blank expressions of soldiers following orders. The 4th was Kale. Kale watched the human lying broken on the floor, and something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked very much like the thing the Palaxian had learned a new word for. He reached to his belt and quietly deactivated his section's surveillance feed. Nobody noticed, but something in the compound had changed, and it could not be changed back. Elias survived. This was not supposed to happen. The medical staff said so in their report, using language that tried very hard to be clinical, but could not quite hide the disbelief underneath. Level 8 neural stimulation had a documented fatality rate of 63% across all tested species, and a permanent neurological damage rate of 94% among survivors. The human's brain had swollen and bled, and several clusters of neurons had been destroyed entirely, and the left hand would never stop trembling, and his hearing on one side was gone, and there would be seizures for the rest of his life, which given the damage might not be very long. But he was alive and he was conscious, and on the second day after the cycle his eyes focused on the ceiling above him, and he whispered a word that the cell microphone barely caught. It was a name. Torek. He was asking about the young Torvan. The medical staff did not know what to do with this information, so they included it in their report and moved on. The compound knew what had happened. Scytharak had not intended for it to be public knowledge, but information in a place like this moved like water through cracks, impossible to contain entirely. The guards talked in low voices during shift changes, and the slaves heard them, and the slaves whispered to each other through walls and grates, and across the exercise yard in the language of glances and small gestures, that the oppressed develop everywhere the oppressed exist. The human had taken level 8. The human was still alive. The human had asked about someone else before he asked about himself. This knowledge moved through the population like electricity through a wire, and everywhere it touched something woke up. Torek the young Torvan stopped lowering his eyes when guards walked past. The Palaxian female started humming again, the cadence, Elia's cadence, and this time she did it loudly enough for others to hear. The old Clixian scratched a new mark on the underside of his workstation, and next to it, he scratched a word he had not known a month ago. Hope. Scytharak was not sleeping. His staff noticed because Draelith's sleep cycles were rigid and predictable, and deviation from them was a sign of psychological distress that would have been flagged immediately in any of his subjects. He spent his nights in the monitoring room reviewing footage and data and compliance reports, and searching for the moment where he had lost control, because he was certain there had been a specific moment, a single point of failure that he could identify and correct. He could not find it. The failure was not a moment. It was a process, slow and organic and utterly unlike anything in his experience. It was the sound of a rough voice singing through soundproofed walls. It was a name whispered through a ventilation grate. It was a Torvan leaving food for a stranger. It was the word hope passed from cell to cell like a flame that could not be extinguished because it did not need fuel. It was its own fuel. It burned on nothing but the knowledge that it existed. Ulven submitted her resignation on a data tablet left on Scytharak's desk. The message was brief. The Warden Lord sought to study the limits of human endurance, it read. He found them, they are his own. I will not be party to what comes next. She was gone before Scytharak finished reading it. He did not pursue her. He had more immediate concerns. Kale the young guard had been making unauthorized visits to the medical bay, where Elias was being kept, while his body attempted to repair what level 8 had done to it. The surveillance feeds in that section were still down, because Kale had disabled them, and the replacement parts had been requisitioned, but not yet delivered, because the compound supply chain was beginning to show the same subtle signs of dysfunction as everything else. Kale brought water and nutrient packs, and a thin blanket that was not standard issue. He did not know why he was doing it. Or rather, he did know, but he did not have the framework to articulate it, because the Draelith were not a species given to introspection about matters of conscience. They followed orders and hierarchy, and the chain of command was the architecture of their entire civilization. But something had broken in that architecture when Kale had watched a small, soft creature with no armor and no claws lie on a cold floor in its own blood, after being subjected to a punishment designed to kill it. And the first thing it did when it regained consciousness was ask about someone else's well-being. That was not supposed to be possible. It did not fit any model of behavior that Kale had been taught. And yet it had happened, and he had seen it, and he could not unsee it. On the fifth night, Elias was conscious enough to talk. His voice was rough and wrong, damaged by the seizures, and he had to pause frequently because his thoughts kept getting tangled in the wreckage of his own neurology. Why, he asked Kale, and it was not a philosophical question, it was practical. He wanted to know why a guard was bringing him supplies. Kale stood in the dim medical bay with his mandibles pressed tight together and tried to find the answer. "Because you made me remember that I chose this," he said finally. "I chose to be a guard, I chose to work here, I chose to follow orders, and that means I can choose differently." Elias looked at him for a long time with his one good eye, because the other was still swollen shut. "Yeah," he said quietly, "yeah, you can." Sithrak discovered the tampering 3 days later. The missing supplies were flagged by an inventory audit, and the disabled surveillance feeds were flagged by a security review, and the connection between them was flagged by Sithrak's own obsessive attention to detail, which had once been his greatest strength and was now consuming him. He had Kale dragged from his quarters in the middle of the night cycle. The young guard did not resist. He stood before Sithrak in the central yard with his wrists bound and his uniform stripped, and he did not lower his eyes. Sithrak summoned the entire compound. Every guard and every slave was brought to the yard and arranged in rows, and the light towers were activated so that the gray stone was bathed in cold white light that made everything look like it was already dead. Elias was brought out last. 2 guards had to support him because his legs could not carry his own weight consistently, and his left hand shook at his side like a broken mechanical thing, and the right side of his face was still dark with bruising. He looked like something that should have been dead and had simply refused to cooperate with that expectation. Sithrak stood in the center of the yard with Kale kneeling before him and addressed the assembly. "This guard has betrayed his oath and his species and his warden lord," he said, and his voice carried across the stone with the weight of absolute authority. "He has given comfort to a prisoner and tampered with security systems and violated every code that holds this compound together. He will be executed at dawn as an example of what happens when discipline fails." He turned to Elias. "And you will watch." This was the moment. Sithrak had calculated it with the precision that had made him legendary. The human had endured his own pain because humans apparently could do that. But this was different. This was a young man about to die because of Elias specifically, because Elias had been kind and Kale had been moved by that kindness, and now kindness itself was going to be punished with death. This was the trap that no empathic species had ever escaped. The guilt would be unsurvivable. The human would finally shatter. Elias stood swaying between his 2 guards and looked at Kale kneeling on the stone, and looked at the assembled ranks of slaves and soldiers, and looked at Sithrak, standing over all of them like a monument to cruelty given form. And the human did something that no one expected. He pulled himself free of the guards supporting him. He nearly fell, but he did not fall. He straightened his broken body 1 vertebra at a time like a man, rebuilding himself from the ground up, and he stood as tall as his damaged frame would allow, which was not very tall at all, but somehow in that moment, it was the tallest thing in the yard. He looked Sithrak directly in the eyes. And he spoke. Not in a whisper, and not in a shout, but in a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent compound the way truth carries, without needing to be loud. "You keep trying to prove that cruelty is stronger than kindness," Elias said, "but look around you. Look at what you have become trying to break one man. You have not slept in weeks. Your psychologist has abandoned you. Your guards are questioning their orders. Your entire compound is falling apart, and I am still here." He paused, and the silence was so complete that the only sound was the wind moving across the gray stone. "You have not broken me," he said. "You have broken yourself." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The words hung in the cold air like something physical, like something that had weight and shape and could not be taken back. Sithrak stared at the human. The human stared back. And then Kale moved. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply stood up. His wrists were still bound, and he was still condemned, and nothing about his physical situation had changed. But he stood, and in standing he made a choice, and the sound of that choice rippled outward through the assembled ranks like a stone dropped into still water. 3 guards in the second row lowered their weapons. Not dramatically, and not with any declaration. They just let the barrels drop until they pointed at the ground. A Torvan in the slave ranks lifted his head. Then another. Then another. The old Clixian straightened his 6 legs for the first time in years, and stood at his full height, which was considerable, and looked at Sithrak with eyes that were no longer empty. The slaves did not kneel. The guards did not fire. And Sithrak stood in the center of his own compound, surrounded by the ruins of his authority, and understood for the first time what Olven had been trying to tell him. The human had not been the one at risk of breaking. It had always been everything else. What happened next was not a war. Sithrak had prepared for war because war was something he understood, a contest of force against force, where the stronger side prevailed, and the weaker side submitted, and the universe continued to operate according to rules that made sense. What happened instead was something far more dangerous. The compound simply stopped working. Not all at once and not with any coordinated signal, but in the way that a machine stops when enough of its parts quietly decide they do not want to turn anymore. The morning shift of guards arrived at their posts and stood there, and did not open the cell doors to begin the daily work rotations. The kitchen staff prepared food and distributed it equally to everyone, including the slaves in isolation who had been on restricted rations. The surveillance operators sat at their stations and watched their screens and did not report the dozens of compliance violations happening in every corridor. It was not rebellion. It was refusal. And refusal, as Sithrak was discovering, was much harder to fight than rebellion, because rebellion gave you an enemy to crush and refusal simply gave you silence. He stormed through the compound barking orders that echoed off walls and came back to him unanswered. He stood in the central corridor and commanded the nearest guard to restrain a Torvan who had walked out of his cell without authorization. And the guard looked at him and looked at the Torvan and looked at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time, and said, "No." Just that. Just no. The smallest word in any language, and the most devastating. Sithrak felt something crack inside his chest, and it was not a physical thing, but it was real, a fracture in the absolute certainty that had been the foundation of his entire existence. The certainty that will could be broken, and that he was the one who could break it. He retreated to his command center. The room was circular and lined with screens that showed every section of the compound, and on every screen something was wrong. In cell block A, the slaves were sitting together in the corridor sharing food and talking in low voices, and some of them were laughing, which was a sound that had not been heard in these walls in over a decade. In cell block B, a Draelith guard was helping a Clixian worker repair a broken limb brace, using tools from the guard's own maintenance kit. In the medical bay, Kale was sitting beside Elias, and the human was conscious and speaking, and Kale was listening with the intensity of someone hearing something important for the first time. In the exercise yard, the Palaxian female was standing in the center of the open space with her face turned up toward the dark sky, and she was singing, not the cadence but something new, something that came from her own people, a song she had not remembered she knew until this morning. Scytharak watched all of it on his screens and understood that his compound, his empire, his life's work, was over. Not because someone had overpowered him. Not because an army had come to liberate the prisoners. Not because of politics or economics or any force that operated on the level of nations and fleets. Because one human being had refused to stop being a human being. That was all. That was everything. In a final act of desperate fury, Scytharak accessed the master collar control system and activated every neural collar in the compound simultaneously at level 5. The effect was immediate and horrible. Dozens of slaves collapsed where they stood, their bodies seizing as pain signals overwhelmed their nervous systems. The Torvans fell like trees. The Clixians crumpled onto their multiple legs. The Palaxian song cut off mid-note as she hit the ground. Scytharak watched the screens and waited for the order to reassert itself, waited for the pain to remind everyone of who held the power and how the world really worked. But the guards moved. Not all of them, but enough of them. They went to the fallen slaves and they dragged them into sheltered positions, and they shielded them with their own bodies, and Kale's voice came over the compound intercom, because he had somehow gotten access to the communication system. "Medical teams to all cell blocks," he said, and his voice was steady and clear. "All guards who stand with us report to your nearest corridor junction. Protect the prisoners. This ends now." Scytharak activated level 7. More slaves fell, and the ones who were still conscious screamed, and some of the guards staggered, because the collars did not discriminate between friend and enemy, between those who obeyed and those who did not. But still they did not stop. Hands reached for fallen bodies and pulled them to safety. Guards who had spent years enforcing Scytharaks now formed lines in the corridors with their backs to the slaves, and their faces toward the command center, and they did not move. Scytharak reached for level 8. His hand hovered over the control. Level 8 would kill some of them. Not immediately perhaps, but the neurological damage would be catastrophic across a population. This large and some percentage would simply not survive. He knew this. He had designed it this way. His hand did not move, because the screens were showing him something he had never seen before and could not look away from. In the medical bay, Elias Wren was on his feet. He should not have been able to stand, and the medical data streaming across the bottom of the screen confirmed this. His vitals were terrible, and his brain activity was erratic, and his left hand was shaking so badly it was almost vibrating. But he was standing, and he was walking, slowly and badly, and with one hand braced against the wall, and each step clearly costing him something that could not be measured in any unit Scytharak recognized. He walked out of the medical bay and into the corridor. The slaves who saw him went quiet. The guards who saw him went still. He walked through his own pain and through the pain of everyone around him, and he did not stop, moving through the compound like something that could not be stopped, because stopping was simply not in its design. He was not leading a charge. He was not giving orders. He was just walking, one foot in front of the other, a small damaged human being moving through a place that had been built to destroy him, and refusing with every step to be destroyed. And everywhere he passed, people stood up. The Torvans stood up. The Clixians stood up. The Palaxian stood up and wiped blood from her mouth and began to sing again, quietly at first and then louder. Kale fell in beside Elias and walked with him, and then other guards joined, and then slaves joined. And by the time the human reached the central corridor, there was a river of beings behind him, wounded and shaking and afraid but moving, all of them moving. Sithrak sat alone in his command center. The screen showed him a compound in which his authority no longer existed. The comm channels were full of voices he could not control. The collar system was still active, but no one was responding to it anymore. Not because the pain had stopped, but because they had decided collectively and individually, and in the strange, miraculous way that beings decide things when someone shows them, it is possible that the pain was no longer enough to make them kneel. His hand was still hovering over the level 8 control. He pulled it back. He sat down in his command chair. He did nothing. 3 hours later, a compact patrol vessel entered orbit around Keth 4, drawn by a distress signal that Kale had managed to broadcast using the compound's long-range communications array. The patrol team that descended to the surface found something they had not expected. The compound was quiet. Not the quiet of death or suppression, but the quiet of something that had settled, like the calm after a storm when everything is still wet and broken, but the wind has stopped. The slaves were in the medical bay, and the common areas being tended by the guards who had turned, their collars deactivated using the master codes that Kale had extracted from the security system. Sithrak was in his command center, sitting in his chair, staring at nothing. He did not resist when they came for him. He did not speak. He looked like something that had been hollowed out from the inside, like a shell that had once contained something powerful and certain, and was now just empty. Elias Wren was unconscious in the medical bay. He had collapsed shortly after the patrol vessel's arrival, as if his body had been running on something beyond physical capability, and had finally been given permission to stop. Kale was beside him. He had not left the human side since the walk through the compound, and he did not intend to leave now. The patrol commander was a veteran Draelith officer named Surath, who had served 40 years in the compact fleet, and had seen war zones and disaster sites, and the aftermath of things that kept her awake at night. But she had never seen anything like this. She stood in the medical bay looking down at the sleeping human, this small battered creature with a trembling hand and blood on his face, and a body that by every medical metric should have given up days ago. What happened here? She asked Kale. Kale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the human, and then at the other patients in the bay, Torvans and Palaxians and Clixians and others, all of them broken in various ways and all of them alive, and all of them free because of the creature on the bed in front of him. The Warden Lord tried to break the human, Kale said slowly, choosing each word with care. But humans do not break the way other species do. They crack and they bleed and they scar, and then they get back up. And every time they get back up, something in the thing trying to break them does not. Surath looked at the human for a long time. Then she pulled out her data pad and opened the patrol report and scrolled to the section on species classification, where standard threat assessments were logged for future reference. She thought about what she had seen today. She thought about a species that dreamed its own worlds when you took away the light and sang when you tried to freeze it, and built hope out of nothing, and gave it away to strangers, and stood up after being knocked down, and stood up again and again and again, until the thing doing the knocking was too exhausted, and too broken, and too lost to continue. She began to type. Species classification: human. Do not engage. Do not contain. Do not attempt to break. She paused and then added one final line. Threat level: existential. She saved the report and closed the data pad and looked once more at the small sleeping figure on the medical bay bed. Elias Wren, Corporal, Colonial Marine Corps, 3rd Expeditionary Division. A man who had been tortured and starved and frozen, and burned and electrocuted and broken, in every way that a body could be broken, and who had responded to all of it by teaching a stranger the word for hope. Sureth turned and walked out of the medical bay. Behind her the human slept, and for the first time in a very long time, the compound was silent, not because someone had demanded silence, but because the people in it were finally at peace. And far away across the galaxy on 1,000 worlds, where humans walked and talked and laughed and fought and fell down and got back up again, the universe continued to learn what the Draelith had learned on a barren moon orbiting a dying star. That you could break a human's body, and you could break a human's bones, and you could break everything around a human, until there was nothing left but dust and silence. But you could not break the thing inside them that made them human. And if you tried, something else would break instead.